The machine gun fire didn't sound like individual shots anymore. It was a continuous ripping noise, like fabric tearing across the surface of the earth. Black volcanic sand jumped and spat under the impact, each bullet kicking up tiny bursts just inches from where Corporal Hershel Williams lay pressed flat against the ground. He could feel the heat of it through his uniform. On his back sat 70 pounds of pressurized fuel. One bullet in the wrong place, one lucky shot into the nitrogen tank, and he wouldn't just die. He would disappear in a violent explosion of fire. Williams didn't move. He couldn't. Ahead of him stretched 40 meters of open ground. No trees. No rocks big enough to hide behind. Just loose black sand that swallowed boots and slowed every step like quicksand. Beyond that, embedded into the volcanic terrain, sat the first Japanese pillbox, low, reinforced concrete, almost invisible except for one thing. A narrow firing slit. From that slit came death. The machine gun inside had been cutting down Marines since dawn. Behind Williams, his company was pinned. Men who had survived the beach landing now lay trapped, unable to move forward, unable to retreat. Tanks had tried to push through earlier, Shermans, but the sand swallowed them. Their treads spun uselessly, engines roaring while Japanese gunners calmly waited for them to stall before targeting the infantry behind. Everything had failed. Everything except one option. A man with a flamethrower. Williams shifted slightly, pressing his body deeper into the sand as another burst snapped overhead. The rounds passed so close he could hear the crack of air splitting around them. He was 21 years old. 5'6". 2 years earlier, the Marine Corps had rejected him for that exact reason. Too short. Back then, he had walked out of the recruitment office in West Virginia and gone back to driving trucks and hauling lumber. The war had felt far away. Something happening to other people. But the war had a way of pulling everyone in. In 1943, the Marines lowered their height requirement. Williams enlisted immediately. Now, less than 2 years later, he was lying on a volcanic island in the Pacific, carrying one of the most dangerous weapons in the war, and the only thing standing between his company and total destruction. The island was Iwo Jima. 8 square miles of volcanic rock turned into a fortress. For 12 months, Japanese forces had transformed it into something no invasion plan had truly accounted for. Underground tunnels stretched for miles. Reinforced bunkers connected to each other in a web of overlapping fire. Every inch of open ground was covered by multiple guns. Nothing moved without being seen. Nothing advanced without being hit. The Marines had landed 4 days earlier. By nightfall on the first day alone, thousands were already dead or wounded. And still they had barely moved. Progress wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in yards. And every yard cost blood. Williams knew all of this. But none of it mattered right now. All that mattered was the pillbox in front of him. And the weapon on his back. The M2-2 flamethrower wasn't like a rifle. It wasn't precise. It wasn't forgiving. It didn't allow distance. To use it effectively, you had to get close. Very close. Close enough to look directly into the position that was trying to kill you. Close enough to see the men inside. He adjusted his grip on the flame gun nozzle, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Behind him, 4 riflemen spread out slightly, forming a loose line. They were his cover team. Their job was simple and nearly suicidal. They would fire directly at the pillbox opening, forcing the Japanese gunners to duck for just a second or two. That second was everything. That second was the only window Williams had to move. One of the riflemen shouted something. He didn't catch the words, but the tone was clear. Ready. Williams nodded, even though no one could see it. The firing started instantly. Sharp, controlled bursts from M1 Garand slammed into the concrete face of the bunker. Sparks and fragments chipped off the edges of the firing slit. For a moment, the machine gun inside faltered. That was it. That was the opening. Williams pushed himself up and ran. The first step sank deeper than he expected. The sand gave way under his boot, pulling him down, stealing his momentum. The weight on his back shifted, dragging his center of gravity backward. He fought to stay upright, forcing his legs to move faster. 10 meters. The machine gun came alive again. Bullets tore into the ground to his left, then his right, walking toward him. He dropped instantly. Flat. The sand slammed into his chest as he hit the ground, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs. More rounds snapped overhead. Behind him, the rifleman fired again. Another brief pause. Williams crawled forward. Each movement was slow, deliberate. Elbows digging into the sand. Knees dragging. The flamethrower tanks scraping against the ground behind him. 15 meters. Now he could see the slit clearly. A dark horizontal line in gray concrete. Inside it, flashes of light, muzzle bursts. They were still firing. Still waiting for him. Still trying to kill him. He didn't stop. By the time he reached 10 meters, everything slowed down. The noise faded into the background. The chaos of the battlefield narrowed into a single point. The opening. The target. He rose onto one knee, brought the nozzle up, and squeezed the trigger. A sharp hiss burst from behind him as compressed nitrogen forced fuel through the hose. At the tip of the nozzle, the igniter sparked. And then, fire. A stream of burning fuel shot forward, arcing through the air like a living thing. It struck the concrete just below the slit, splashing upward. The flame curled over the edge and went inside. The effect was immediate. The machine gun stopped. Not gradually. Not slowly. Instantly. Inside the sealed bunker, oxygen vanished in seconds. The burning fuel consumed everything: air, space, life. The men inside didn't have time to react. Didn't have time to escape. Didn't have time to understand what was happening. Williams held the trigger just long enough. Then released. Silence. The first pillbox was dead. He didn't celebrate. Didn't pause. Didn't even look back. Because he already knew what came next. 6 more. Behind him, the battlefield hadn't changed. His company was still pinned. More machine guns were already firing, from different angles now. The network wasn't broken. Not yet. Turned. And began crawling back across the same open ground. This time, the enemy knew exactly where he was. Williams didn't stand up right away. He stayed low, dragging himself backward across the same black sand he had just crossed. Only now every gun on that section of the battlefield knew exactly where he was. The second pillbox had already opened fire. Tracers cut across the ground in front of him, then adjusted, walking closer, searching for his body. The Japanese gunners had seen the first bunker go silent. They understood what had happened. And they knew what he was. A flamethrower operator. The most dangerous man on the field. And the most exposed. He crawled faster. Not reckless, never reckless, but with urgency. Each movement was controlled, deliberate. Elbows digging deep. Boots pushing through loose cinder. The empty flamethrower tanks dragged behind him, heavier now that adrenaline was fading. A burst struck the ground just inches from his arm. Hot sand sprayed across his face. He didn't stop. Behind him, the riflemen shifted fire, redirecting their shots toward the second pillbox. Their rounds struck the concrete, forcing the enemy gunners to hesitate, just enough. One of the riflemen cried out. Williams didn't turn to look. He couldn't afford to. By the time he reached the company line, his lungs were burning. Hands raw. Uniforms streaked black with volcanic dust. He rolled onto his side and unstrapped the empty M2-2. A fresh flamethrower was already waiting. The men behind the line worked fast. They had seen what he had done. They understood what it meant. Fuel tanks, nitrogen pressure, checked. Igniter, loaded. No words were exchanged. There wasn't time. Williams grabbed the straps and swung the new unit onto his back. The weight slammed into his shoulders, settling against his spine like a second body. He tightened the harness. Checked the hose. Picked up the nozzle. Less than 90 seconds. That was all it took. Then he turned back toward the battlefield. The second pillbox sat further out, about 80 meters from the first. Its firing slit faced directly toward the route Williams had just used. A frontal approach would be suicide. He knew it instantly. So he didn't take it. Instead, he moved wide, circling to the right, staying low. The ground dipped slightly, a shallow depression in the volcanic field. It wasn't much. Maybe a foot, maybe less. Enough to hide his body if he stayed crouched. Not enough to hide the fuel tanks. They rose above his shoulders like a signal. A target. Gunfire cracked overhead. His cover team had repositioned, firing from a different angle now, trying to pull attention away from him. It worked. Barely. Williams moved quickly through the depression, keeping his profile as low as possible. Every few steps, he paused, listening, watching, calculating. The battlefield wasn't random. It was a system. Every pillbox supported the others. Every movement triggered a response. He was starting to see the pattern. He reached the rear of the second bunker. And there it was. The pipe. 4 inches wide, protruding from the concrete roof. A ventilation shaft. Every enclosed bunker needed air. Gun smoke, heat, carbon monoxide. Without ventilation, the crew inside would suffocate themselves. The pipe was their lifeline. No, it was their weakness. Williams climbed onto the low roof. The concrete was rough beneath his hands. Still warm from the sun. He positioned himself beside the pipe, adjusting the nozzle angle carefully. No rushing. No mistakes. At this distance, everything mattered. He inserted the nozzle directly into the opening and pulled the trigger. The reaction was immediate. Flame didn't just enter the bunker. It was pulled inside, drawn down like air through a chimney. Except this was the reverse. Fire pouring into a sealed space. The confined interior amplified everything: heat, pressure, consumption of oxygen. There was no escape. No defense. No survival. Williams released the trigger. Silence followed. 2 pillboxes down. He slid off the roof and hit the ground running, then dropped flat again as another burst tore across the sand. A third position had opened fire. Further out. Hidden until now. That was how the system worked. Destroy one. Expose the next. He crawled back again. Same ground. Same distance. Same risk. But now the enemy had adjusted. They were faster. More aggressive. More focused. By the time he reached the line again, 2 of his cover riflemen were wounded. Still firing. Still holding. Another flamethrower was ready. Williams didn't hesitate. He swapped the empty unit for a full one, fingers moving automatically now. The process had already become routine. Unstrap. Secure. The third pillbox was positioned differently. 40 meters west of the second. Built into a low ridge. Its firing arc covered a wide section of the battlefield, locking down any attempt to move forward. To reach it, Williams would have to cross a section of open ground that hadn't been touched yet. Untested. Unseen. He moved anyway. Halfway there, everything changed. A new stream of fire ripped across the sand in front of him. Not from the third bunker. From somewhere else. A 4th pillbox. Hidden further north. The bullets came in fast, low, cutting off his approach completely. Williams dropped flat. Didn't move. Didn't breathe. His cover team couldn't suppress both positions. 4 men, even uninjured, could barely handle one. Now they were down to fewer. And the battlefield had shifted. For a moment, everything stopped. Williams lay motionless in the open. No cover. No protection. Just sand and incoming fire. Seconds passed. Then more. Later, survivors would estimate he stayed there for nearly 2 minutes. 2 full minutes under direct threat. Waiting. Watching. Calculating. The 4th pillbox shifted its fire. Not toward him. Toward the rifleman. That was the moment. Williams moved. Relentless. He pushed forward on his elbows, closing the distance to the third bunker before the guns could swing back. This time, there was no clean vent pipe. No easy access point. But there was an opening. Partially hidden. Enough. He raised the nozzle. Fired. The flame hit the rear of the bunker and spilled inside. The effect was the same. Immediate. Final. 3 pillboxes destroyed. Williams didn't stop. Didn't slow. Didn't think about what he had just done. Because now, he understood something. Every bunker he eliminated revealed the next one. The entire defensive network was connected. Layered. Dependent. And if he kept going, if he didn't stop, he could break it. Behind him, the battlefield was changing. The pattern of fire was shifting. What had once been a wall of overlapping gunfire was starting to thin. Not gone. Not yet. But weakening. Williams crawled back again. For the fourth time. Across the same stretch of open ground. The difference now? Every gun on the field was hunting him. The battlefield had changed, but not in a way that made survival any easier. By the time Hershel Woody Williams reached for his fifth flamethrower, the fight had already entered a new phase. The Japanese defensive network wasn't gone, it was breaking, piece by piece. And that made it even more dangerous. Earlier, every pillbox had been part of a perfect system. Interlocking fields of fire, overlapping kill zones, each bunker protecting the next. But now, with multiple positions destroyed, that system was collapsing into chaos. And chaos meant unpredictability. Gunfire no longer came from clean, predictable angles. It came in bursts. Sudden. Uncoordinated. Deadly. Williams didn't have the luxury of thinking about the bigger picture. He focused on the next objective. The fifth pillbox. The fifth position was different. It wasn't clearly visible like the others. It was buried, almost completely swallowed by volcanic rubble. Only a narrow slit gave away its presence, angled downward to target infantry crawling across the ground. A perfect ambush position. Williams didn't go straight at it. By now, he had learned something critical. Every bunker had a weakness, but only if you approached it the right way. He moved wide, circling through uneven terrain, keeping low, using every inch of ground, even the smallest dips, as concealment. His cover team was down to just 2 effective riflemen. That meant less suppression, less distraction, less time, more risk. They fired anyway. Each shot they took wasn't just covering fire, it was buying seconds. And seconds were the only currency Williams had left. He reached the rear. There it was again, the detail that kept saving his life. A vent pipe. Barely noticeable, but vital. Williams climbed up, steadying himself on the rough concrete, the flamethrower tanks shifting heavily on his back. He angled the nozzle downward into the pipe. No hesitation. He pulled the trigger. Fire didn't just enter the bunker, it flooded it. Inside that sealed space, the effect was immediate. Oxygen vanished. Heat surged. The confined interior turned into a furnace in seconds. The machine gun stopped. 5 down. 2 left. The breaking point. It was now nearly noon. 3 hours under continuous fire. Williams had crossed that same deadly stretch of ground again and again. Every return trip was worse than the last, because now the enemy knew exactly where to look. His uniform was scorched. His hands were blistering from repeated exposure to the weapon's heat. His body was exhausted. But the mission wasn't finished. And stopping now meant everything he had done would be wasted. Behind him, Marines were watching. Not moving. Waiting. Pinned down for hours. Their entire advance depended on one man finishing what he started. The 6th pillbox. The 6th bunker sat deeper in the network. Unlike the earlier ones, it was protected by terrain and connected to nearby positions through a partially collapsed trench system. That trench was dangerous. It allowed Japanese soldiers to move unseen, reposition, and counterattack without ever exposing themselves. Williams couldn't risk that route. So he adapted again. He used the ruins of the 5th pillbox as concealment. What was once an enemy strongpoint was now his shield. He moved along its edge, staying low, using smoke and debris to break his silhouette. Step by step. Meter by meter. Closer. The 6th bunker had no visible vent from his angle. No easy entry point. Just a sealed rear plate, steel set into concrete. No obvious weakness. But Williams didn't need obvious. He looked closer. There, a tiny gap. Just inches wide, where the steel plate met the concrete frame. That was enough. He pressed the nozzle against the seam. Pulled the trigger. The flamethrower roared to life. Burning fuel forced its way through that narrow gap, spraying inside along the floor. Inside the bunker, there was nowhere to escape. No time to react. The fire spread instantly. The gun fell silent. 6. No fuel. 1 target left. Williams stepped back. The flamethrower on his back was empty. No more fuel. No more second chances. Only one bunker remained, the strongest one. The anchor of the entire defensive system. Everything up to this point had been leading to this final position. And now he would have to take it without the weapon that had carried him this far. The final assault begins. Back at the company line, there was no time to rest. No time to think. Williams dropped the empty flamethrower and reached for something else. A demolition charge. A crude but deadly tool, explosives mounted on a pole, designed to be shoved into openings at point-blank range. Unlike the flamethrower, this weapon had almost no reach. To use it, he would have to get closer than ever before. Closer than any sane man would choose. But by now, there was no turning back. He gripped the charge, turned, and walked back toward the fight. The 7th pillbox, the heart of the defense. The final bunker sat deeper than all the others. It was built into a natural depression, reinforced on all sides. Its firing slit covered the main approach, the very ground the Marines needed to advance. Earlier, it had been untouchable, protected by the 6 positions Williams had already destroyed. But it was alone. For the first time all day, the advantage had shifted. But only slightly, because this bunker still had one thing: a clear shot at anyone who approached from the front. Williams didn't go that way. He moved west, a direction that had been impossible just hours earlier, once covered by overlapping fire. Now open, because he had made it open, setting the final charge. He reached the blind side, climbed onto the low roof, found the vent shaft. Same weakness, same opportunity, different weapon. He lowered the demolition charge into the opening. Let go. The moved. Fest. He dropped off the structure and hit the ground. A second later, the explosion tore through the bunker. Concrete collapsed inward. Dust and debris erupted from every opening. And then, silence. The line breaks. At 12:31 p.m., the final machine gun stopped firing. For the first time since morning, there was no incoming fire, no bullets cutting across the sand, no invisible wall holding the Marines in place. Just silence. Then movement. Slow at first, then faster. Marines began rising from craters, from behind ridges, from positions where they had been pinned for hours. They moved forward, through the narrow gap Williams had created. A gap barely 200 meters wide. But it was enough. More than enough. Because that gap broke the entire defensive line. One man versus an entire fortress. In 4 hours, 7 pillboxes destroyed, 6 flamethrowers used, 1 demolition charge, dozens of enemy positions neutralized, an entire company freed to advance. What tanks couldn't do, what bombardment couldn't achieve, one Marine had done, alone. When the last explosion faded and the 7th pillbox fell silent, the battlefield didn't erupt in celebration. It exhaled, slow, heavy, exhausted. 4 hours, the Marines had been pinned to the ground, unable to move, unable to fight forward, trapped under a storm of machine gun fire. Now, for the first time since morning, they could stand. And they did. Carefully at first. Then with urgency. They moved through the narrow corridor that Hershel Woody Williams had carved, step by step across the same volcanic sand that had swallowed men, tanks, and hope just hours earlier. What he created wasn't a breakthrough across the entire island. It was something more precise. A fracture. And that fracture shattered the Japanese defensive network in that sector. The advance resumes. Once the firing stopped, the battlefield changed instantly. Where there had been paralysis, there was now movement. Rifle squads pushed forward, spreading out, securing ground that had been unreachable all morning. Engineers followed behind, marking cleared positions. Corpsmen rushed to the wounded who had been lying exposed for hours. The momentum had returned. And in war, momentum is everything. The company reached its objective later that day, the first real progress since landing on the island days earlier. But the battle itself was far from over. The war beyond one man. The island of Iwo Jima was still a nightmare. What Williams had broken was just one section of a much larger system. Miles of tunnels, hundreds of fortified caves, hidden artillery positions, and defenders who had no intention of surrendering. The terrain only got worse. Sharp ridges, sulfur vents, collapsed tunnels, heat rising from the volcanic ground like a living thing. The Japanese defenders adapted constantly, emerging from underground passages behind American lines, launching sudden attacks, then disappearing again. There were no clear front lines. No safe zones. Every inch forward had to be fought for. And again. 34 days of hell. The battle lasted 36 days. Williams fought for 34 of them. After his assault on the pillboxes, he didn't get rest. He didn't get pulled back. He went right back into the fight, clearing caves, supporting advances, facing the same dangers over and over. Flamethrower operators like him had one of the lowest survival rates on the battlefield. They were priority targets, easy to spot, and catastrophic if hit. Out of hundreds deployed during the battle, only a small fraction survived. Williams carried that weapon through nearly the entire campaign, day after day, knowing exactly what it meant, the wound that ended his war. On March 6th, everything changed. A Japanese mortar round detonated near his position. The blast tore into his body, shrapnel ripping through his legs and side. After more than a month of continuous combat, his war ended in an instant. He was evacuated, first to a field hospital on the beach, then to a hospital ship offshore. For the first time in over a month, he was out of the fight, but not out of the war inside his mind. A recognition he never asked for. While Williams lay recovering, something else was happening. His company commander had already written the report. Precise. Backed by witnesses. The 4-hour assault. 7 pillboxes. 1 man. That report moved up the chain of command. Battalion, regiment, division. And at every level, the conclusion was the same. This wasn't just bravery. This was something beyond it. The paperwork began. A nomination for the highest military honor. The Medal of Honor. Months later, after the war had ended, Williams stood in the White House. Across from him was Harry S. Truman. The room was formal, quiet, filled with officials, officers, and witnesses to a moment that would be recorded in history. Williams was just 22 years old. When the medal was placed around his neck, it represented everything he had done on that battlefield. But to him, it represented something else. Something heavier. The weight he carried. To the world, he was a hero. To himself, he was a survivor. And that difference mattered. Because surviving meant remembering. Every step across that sand. Every burst of fire. Every bunker. Every man who didn't make it back. Especially the 2 riflemen who had covered him. Firing, reloading, exposing themselves again and again so he could move forward. They died out there. And for years, he didn't even know their names. That question stayed with him long after the war ended. Not the medal. Not the recognition. Just 2 missing names. The silent battle after the war. Like many veterans of World War II, Williams came home carrying more than wounds. What he experienced would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, it didn't have a name people understood. But its effects were real. Nightmares. Flashbacks. Moments where the past didn't feel like the past anymore. He struggled. For years. Trying to live a normal life while carrying memories that refused to fade. The sound of pressure releasing, something as simple as air escaping, could bring everything back in an instant. Because it sounded like the flamethrower. Finding a way forward. It took 17 years before something changed. In 1962, Williams experienced a turning point through faith. It didn't erase what he had lived through. Nothing could. But it gave him a way to carry it. To live with it. Instead of being trapped inside it. A life of service. Williams didn't step away from the past. He turned toward others who were still fighting their own battles. He spent decades working with veterans, helping them navigate the same struggles he had faced. Listening. Guiding. Understanding in a way few people could. Because he had been there. Remembering the fallen. Eventually, he found the answer he had been searching for. The names of the 2 riflemen. The men who had stood beside him. Who had made his survival possible. He never spoke their names publicly. Not because he forgot. But because, to him, the medal wasn't his to claim alone. He wore it for them. And for every Marine who didn't come home. The final chapter. Over time, Hershel Woody Williams became something rare. The last living Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. A living connection to a generation that was disappearing. But he didn't spend his final years looking backward. He built something lasting. A foundation dedicated to Gold Star families. The families of those who died in service. Memorials across the United States. Places where names would never be forgotten. Where sacrifice would always be remembered. The end of a long journey. On June 29, 2022, Williams died at the age of 98. He was laid to rest with honors. A Marine who had once been rejected for being too short. What one man changed. On a black sand battlefield in the Pacific, one man crossed open ground under fire. And again. And again. He didn't change the entire war. He didn't end the battle. But in 4 hours, he changed everything for the men around him. He gave them a way forward. Sometimes. What? That's enough to change history.